Welcome to this explainer. Today we're stepping way back into the ancient Near East, and we're going to witness one of the most pivotal transitions in biblical history. We're moving from the fractured, battle-hardened realm of King David to the incredibly wealthy, consolidated empire of his son, King Solomon. I mean, we're talking about an era of massive architectural achievements, international trade, and some really profound geopolitical shifts. But right off the bat, we've got to ask a massive, compelling question. How exactly did the wisest king in recorded history ultimately fall into the trap of unchecked power and pride? It's a paradox that's fascinated scholars for centuries, right? Because think about it, he possessed divine wisdom, unmatched wealth, unprecedented peace, yet the seeds of his empire's downfall were literally sown at the very height of its glory. So to understand how that happened, we need to look at the foundations of his rule. Okay, let's dive right into this. To truly grasp Solomon's reign, we're looking at four key areas today. First, the succession crisis. Second, wisdom, women, and wealth. Third, ancient geopolitics and trade. And finally, building the heavenly temple. Starting with Section 1, the succession crisis, a really dangerous power vacuum. So to understand this transition, we really have to look at the power vacuum leading up to it. King David is nearing the very end of his life. He's elderly, his health is failing, and he actually can't even keep his body warm. A young woman named Abishag is brought in simply to care for him. But this frail image of the once great warrior king creates an atmosphere of deep vulnerability and some intense political maneuvering within the royal court. Because nature abhors a vacuum, and so does an ancient monarchy. David's fourth son, Adonijah, who by the way is technically next in line for the throne, decides to seize the moment. He sets himself up at En Rogel and pulls in some major political heavyweights, the fierce military commander Joab and the priest Abiathar. It is a full-blown coup. But Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, quickly intervene. They warn David that if Adonijah takes over, they're likely going to be treated as criminals and wiped out. So David acts fast. He orders Solomon to be crowned at the Gihon Spring, the massive water source for Jerusalem. And Solomon rides down on David's own royal mule. It's a highly symbolic, very public declaration that he, not Adonijah, is the chosen heir. Let's move to the aftermath and see how this builds. Adonijah's coup fails, and Solomon initially actually shows him mercy. But then Adonijah makes a fatal miscalculation. He asks for permission to marry Abishag, David's young attendant. Now, what's really interesting here is the hidden political subtext. In the ancient world, claiming the former king's concubine or attendant wasn't just romance. It was a blatant claim to the throne itself. We actually saw this earlier when Absalom tried to usurp David by publicly taking his concubines. Solomon recognizes this instantly as a dangerous political statement, basically a renewed attempt to grab power, and he realizes he's forced to eliminate Adonijah to secure his reign. But Solomon also has to deal with his father's unfinished business. Right before he dies, David gives Solomon some very specific instructions regarding what we might call interpersonal justice. He tells Solomon to use his wisdom to deal with Joab, who had shed innocent blood during peacetime, and Shimei, who had notoriously cursed David years earlier. David explicitly tells Solomon not to let their gray heads go down to Sheol in peace. Now, Sheol is a fascinating Hebrew word. In historical prose contexts like this one, it mostly parallels the grave, simply meaning death, though in poetry, it can describe a dark realm of restless spirits. Essentially, David is telling his son to perform some necessary political cleanup to ensure the absolute stability of his new kingdom. Moving to Section 2, Wisdom, Women, and Wealth, the start of Solomon's Golden Age. So with his political enemies dealt with and his throne secure, Solomon's kingdom just explodes into this era of unprecedented prosperity, cultural achievement, and international influence. A fantastic way to remember the defining characteristics of this legacy is through a simple educational mnemonic we can call the 4 W's. Those are wisdom, women, wealth, and worship. We see his legendary wisdom early on when he humbly goes to Gibeon and asks God for a discerning, obedient heart to govern the people. It's a request God famously grants, along with the wealth and security he didn't even ask for. But as we're going to see, these pillars of his reign have both incredibly positive aspects and some deeply troubling dark sides. Let's look at the women aspect. Solomon is famous for having an exorbitant number of wives and concubines, but we really need to view this through the lens of ancient geopolitics. In this era, women were essentially political capital, used to cement international alliances. When a smaller kingdom submitted to Solomon, a marriage alliance sealed the treaty. A concubine was a woman of lesser political stature than a fully betrothed wife, though, to be fair, the ancient Hebrew terminology can sometimes blur those boundaries. So Solomon's marriage to the pharaoh's daughter, for instance, That wasn't just a romance. It was a major, paradigm-shifting political alliance with the absolute powerhouse of Egypt. But here is where the cracks begin to show, and this perfectly captures the tension in Solomon's story. If we look back at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, God laid out explicit, strict rules for future Israelite kings. They were warned not to multiply wives for themselves, lest their hearts turn away. They were warned not to accumulate massive amounts of silver and gold. And they were told not to multiply horses. Yet, what does Solomon do? He blatantly pushes the very edges of all these boundaries. I mean, he accumulates so much silver it isn't even counted. Marriages ultimately introduce foreign idolatry right into the very heart of his kingdom. Which brings us to Section 3, Ancient Geopolitics and Trade, how he funded the empire. How exactly did Solomon finance this incredible, unprecedented buildup of wealth and military might? Like, where was all this money coming from? What's absolutely fascinating is the sheer geographical scale of his dominion. You'll see that Solomon's kingdom expanded all the way from the border of Egypt in the south, taking in the Transjordan, right up to the Euphrates River in the north. But the real key to his wealth wasn't just the sheer size of his land, it was his strategic control over the international coastal highway. This was the ancient world's primary trade artery, connecting the empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And frankly, whoever controlled this highway controlled global commerce. Which leads us to a fascinating, honestly almost humorous historical anecdote from the text. As part of his grand alliance with Egypt, the pharaoh actually attacked and captured a Canaanite city called Gezer, burned it completely to the ground, and then gave the smoldering ruins to his daughter as a wedding gift when she married Solomon. Now, a burned-down, destroyed city sounds like a pretty terrible wedding present, doesn't it? But for a builder like Solomon, it was an absolute goldmine. Because the city was destroyed, it gave Solomon a blank slate. He completely rebuilt Gezer from the ground up into a highly fortified store city. And he did the exact same thing with the cities of Megiddo and Hazor. If you trace the ancient map, any merchant caravan traveling from Mesopotamia down to Egypt had absolutely no choice but to pass through these heavily fortified choke points. Solomon wasn't just letting them pass either, he was taxing them heavily. He exacted tribute from surrounding nations, managed lucrative international trade relations, like his famous wealth exchange with the Queen of Sheba, and he secured absolute economic dominance over the entire region. And now, Section 4, Building the Heavenly Temple, a Cosmic Masterpiece. This brings us to our final W, worship. Shifting from earthly geopolitical triumphs to a grand, cosmic architectural masterpiece in Jerusalem. Up until this point in Israel's history, the people worshipped at the tabernacle. The tabernacle was essentially a mobile tent, a beautiful, modest symbol of God's condescending mercy, tenting right alongside his people as they journeyed through the harsh wilderness of Sinai. But now, under Solomon, the nation is stationary. They have a massive, secure empire. So Solomon builds a massive, permanent temple. It serves as a central place for the 3 pilgrim festivals, but on a highly practical level, it also serves as the ultimate, heavily guarded storage vault for the nation's immense wealth, protecting their secret symbols and their gold all in one secure place. And this brilliantly illustrates how the design of the structure serves a grand theological purpose. According to the texts in Chronicles, the architectural plans for this cosmic structure were actually given to King David by the Holy Spirit. The temple wasn't just a big building. It was purposely designed to be a crude earthly reflection of God's actual throne room in heaven. Outside, there was a massive bronze basin called the Sea, resting on the backs of bronze bulls, used for ritual cleansing. Inside, towering golden cherubim guarded the Ark of the Covenant. Years later, when the prophet Ezekiel has a vision of heaven, he sees a glassy expanse supported by cherubim. So the earthly temple was a physical, visual mirror of that very celestial reality. To wash in the bronze sea and walk past the cherubim into the temple was, symbolically, to step directly into the presence of the Almighty. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Solomon's reign was undeniably a golden age. It brought unprecedented security where, as the text beautifully says, every man lived safely under his own vine and fig tree. But we also see the darker side, the use of conscripted forced labor, the massive accumulation of wealth, and the political compromises with foreign powers that directly violated God's ancient warnings. So the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves as we look at all this data is this: does the blessing of a golden age, with all its incredible wealth and peace, justify the corrupting cost of unchecked pride and compromised values? It's a profound tension between divine blessing and universal human vulnerability that makes Solomon's empire so absolutely fascinating to study. Thanks so much for joining me as we explore this material together, and I really hope this leaves you eager to dig even deeper into the complexities of ancient history. See you next time.